Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's special International Women's Day edition of our Leading Light 75th Anniversary interview series. Now, today I'm really pleased to have two CMI companions and very distinguished campaigners for gender equality, both founding members of the 30% Club. Melanie Richards, CBE, who is the deputy chair or former deputy chair and partner at KPMG. She's also on the government's advisory National Leadership Center panel and a non-exec at Morgan Stanley, among several other board roles. Welcome, Melanie. And Pavita Cooper, the founder of More Difference, again, also a CMI trustee, chair CMI Race Commission, and is on the board of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, among others. So welcome to you both, and happy day after International Women's Day to you both. So this theme of International Women's Day was all about break the bias. And my opening question is, to what extent do you think when we think leaders, we still think male? Is there a bias that people still have that they expect leaders more naturally to be men? What do you think, Melanie?
Well, I think for sure we do. There have been lots of pieces of research that show this. And if you think about, there's a fantastic book which I would recommend to everybody called The Authority Gap, which was written by Marianne Siegert. And she's assimilated all of that research together. And actually, quite often when we talk about this, we assume that we as women don't have those biases. But actually, men and women in equal numbers struggle to see women in authority positions simply because of history. And we have socially conditioned norms around us. So I think we have to be much more intentional and much more thoughtful about what we think good leadership looks like. And, I think there's some good work being done on what skills, we need to be good leaders. But I think we need to start with remembering that we're all biased about what we think both good leadership looks like, and it still looks a little too masculine.
Mm-hmm. And Pavita, what are your thoughts? Do you agree with that?
Oh, I'd completely agree. And I think the really sad thing is it starts really early, right? So when you look at the gender pay gap, it starts with pocket money. And I think when you look at all the research that shows the aspiration and assumptions made by young girls, by the age of 7 or 8, they stop seeing themselves as sporty, and they start using different language around their own skills and capability. And when you ask them things like, "Oh, do you think you're good at maths?" they'll often start saying no, and they'll say, "There's a boy who sits class next to me, he's better than that at me." So it starts really, really early. So I think, society is feeding us lots of these messages. But then, of course, it feeds into when we join the workforce early on, women start seeing themselves in a particular way. And as Melanie says, it's male and female leaders that assign those biases and assumptions and characteristics to all genders.
Mm-hmm. Well, interesting that you both do agree with that. And I mean, obviously, I think you're right, and the stats bear you out. But what would you say to somebody that says, actually, women are better leaders because they place greater emphasis on things like value and ethics and culture? Would you agree with that, or is that controversial? What do you think? Let me start with you, Pavita.
Well, I think it's wrong to make an assumption to say that women only do those things. To me, it's an amplification. So in the financial crisis, one of the things that was observed was that had there been more women on boards at the time, perhaps we wouldn't have seen the devastation that we'd seen in so many organizations that collapse so quickly because of the absence of women, because perhaps they do notice some of those other issues. Maybe they are more risk averse. Maybe they do ask different questions. Maybe they do look at things from a different perspective. And particularly when I think around issues around ethics, they think about the commercial issues, but they also consider those other things. It's not to say that all men don't, but I think it's why diversity is important. By having lots of voices in the room, you ensure that everyone's asking all those questions. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's about saying only men and only women can do those things, but I do think women bring a different lens.
Mm-hmm. Melanie?
I think Pavita's answered it pitch perfectly.
Okay.
And I guess I just encourage people to think about what are the skills and capabilities we need around a table, and they come in many forms. and how do we create that mix, as opposed to thinking about whether a single person can fulfill all of those ambitions.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair point. And I'm going to come on to new definitions of leadership, because I know you both have views on that, and I think it's a fascinating topic, but we'll come on to that later on. And by the way, hopefully we'll have some time for questions from the audience as well. But, CMI, we're celebrating our 75th anniversary. I know for all of us, we've been campaigning for gender equality for what feels like 75 years. What are your reflections? I mean, are we getting there? Is the change too incremental? And what about the change that has been made year on year versus, say, the shock of the pandemic, where it brought forward something like flexible working decades? So, what's your view? Where are we, Melanie?
So, look, I think on one level we can celebrate an enormous amount that's been achieved, but it would be remiss of me to say that I think A, we've got there, or B, that we're still going fast enough. But I think what has changed is, I think we're having a much more intelligent conversation inside most organizations about where we are. And I think we are seeing much more mindful intervention than we've ever seen. But do I think we're going fast enough? Of course I don't. I always remember, and Pavita will recall this, when I look back to when we established the 30% Club, and that movement, that next sort of kickstart was happening, and we were part of a whole host of people that were focusing on this. I suppose in my wildest dreams, there were moments back then, and I have to remind myself about how far we have actually come. And I look at, representation in the boardroom and the sort of quality of conversation that's had around this. But then I look and think, well, if we're going to continue to make incremental progress, there are still so many more mindful interventions that need to happen. And I think at our peril, do we use those sort of headlines about women in the boardroom for the FTSE 350 as a proxy for all of the very small things that need to happen at the same time to make women's lives better in a bigger sense than just the boardroom? So yes, I think we're making an enormous amount of progress, and have, but do I think we can still go faster? Of course I do. And we shouldn't get complacent that, having come as far as we have, that is good enough.
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Pavita? Do you think that we're getting a little complacent and we think that what we've accomplished is good enough?
I think it's tricky, because I'd agree, with everything Mel said. I mean, she's so right. We did make so much progress, right? I think when you think about where we started, and last year we had a moment in time where there was not one business in the FTSE that didn't have a woman on the board, and how fantastic is that? And it was appropriate to stop and recognise that. But I think we've made progress at the very top, and sort of at the sort of entry level. So I do a lot of work in schools, and when I meet young women, I mean, they're brilliant. They just say, oh, I can do whatever I want. They're very aspirational. They don't see any barriers to the world. But I think where we've slowed down is in the middle. So the pandemic has shown us that we have taken back women's progress significantly, because the minute everyone was at home working with their kids, it was predominantly women that had to stop, give up work, and look after their kids and balance everything. They are going back to work at a slower pace than men are. Men were rushing back in droves, but women still had to struggle with school closures, whatever. And I think, we talked a lot at the beginning of the 30% Club about this is not about fixing women, it's about fixing cultures. And I think in the middle, we're stubbornly stuck at around 20% when it comes to progression for women in the pipeline. And that number is not moving. And it hasn't done for a long time. So that tells you we haven't really made progress, apart from at the top and at the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really interesting point. And yes, you're both rightly very proud of the progress that's been made on women on boards. You're both huge advocates for that. And the latest FTSE Women Leaders report shows what's possible when you have that monitoring and constant goal in your sight, right? It exceeded the goal. Do we need more of those processes that, like the FTSE Women Leaders, for other parts? For example, for the middle, should we do more in the middle? And if so, what's the role of institutions in doing that? Melanie?
So I think I'm a data geek, right? I love data. I think it needs to be collected. I think we need, in order to shine a light on issues, there's nothing like fact in order to sort of provoke a conversation and make change. I think the FTSE Women Leaders is starting to pay attention to, and has been actually for the last 5 years, on the progression of women up to the top. And at the end of the day, in order for people to reach the top, you do need them to come through the middle. So the fact that we are now targeting, for more women at chief executive and direct reports into the executive layer are elements of that. I'm a little bit loath, for all of my data geek, to be saying that we need to be measuring many, many, many more things. What I do think is that organizations need to. So I do think at an organizational level, it is absolutely critical that they don't leave this to chance. They need to be measuring what's happening inside the business, who's getting on, why they're getting on, how they're getting on. And some of that will be quantitative and some of it will be qualitative. And this isn't actually just about gender. It's about all forms of diversity, ensuring that we're actually moving and lifting people through the organization that don't necessarily look like a single stereotype. And so I would be advocating more for ensuring that individual companies, alongside important things like pay gap reporting, alongside things like the FTSE Women Leaders Review, which has been extended into large private companies, all of those things make up this mech. But what I wouldn't want to do is start suggesting that we need even more regulation, even more layering of reporting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Pavita, what are your thoughts? I
completely agree, but I think this is where the CMI really comes into its sweet spot, because actually in the middle, that is very much often about the first line manager around those individuals, particularly women. And when they decide to leave, when they don't get the flexibility they require, when they're not given the stretch assignments they need in order to progress to the next level, when they're not selected for promotion, when they're not sponsored, often it's that very initial contact point with their first line manager that causes some of that disruption in the system, which causes them to say, I've had enough, I'm off. So I think it's actually a real focus on what is the role of local line managers in the middle of organizations. And I think there's been so much activity and so many initiatives and so much focus on what happens centrally, what happens at the top with the CEO and the board and all the various initiatives we've talked about. I think in the middle, often line managers can hide and think somebody in the D&I team, somebody else is accountable for that. That's not down to me. And there's a program that these women can go on, or they've got more sponsorship than I ever had. And actually sometimes the degree of frustration and exclusion that they're not included in much of this. So I think that's exactly, Anne, where you and your team come in and can do so much more to support those managers.
Well, it's a good thing you say that. That's what our 75th anniversary project is all about. And we will be releasing the findings of that in June. And we want to do exactly as you say. It is every line manager's responsibility, and we really want to give them that toolkit. But one of the things that we know that has worked as an enabler for many women and carers and others from different backgrounds is the flexible working culture. And we do know that many, many female and male managers are very much in favor of keeping that. Now, what else do you think, Melanie, besides that flexible working culture, might we have picked up in the pandemic that you think might help or hinder women in their advancement?
Well, one of the interesting things, and just to pick up on a point Pavita made, was what we know is how critical the nature of work that we're given to do in our early years is a proxy for how we might progress. So did we get to do interesting projects? Did we get a variety of work, et cetera, et cetera? And I have by the way, I have more anecdotal evidence of this than scientific. Mm-hmm. But I think because when we were working remotely, everybody was working remotely, there was much more having to be mindful about who was doing what. And I don't mean in terms of accountability or productivity, but actually making sure people were how work was being spread.
Mm-hmm.
And I would hope that we can learn from that in returning to the office or going to hybrid working, that we can use the fact that we've learned maybe some new skills on the way about how we're allocating work and responsibility in a purely remote world into that more flexible hybrid environment.
Mm-hmm. And Pavita, what do you think? What do you see?
So I think, Melanie's absolutely spot on in what she's saying about, what we need to be thoughtful about. One of the things I observed in the remote working periods, the companies I was working with, is that actually, despite the fact that people responded positively and they saw many benefits, both men and women, there were certain groups whose the gap in terms of their engagement, but also the degree to which they felt marginalised, actually grew, and that was pretty consistent across all sectors. So if you were from an ethnic minority background, or if you're a woman at a lower level, entry level in the organisation, their engagement gap grew, it got worse.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, particularly for ethnic minorities, that then correlated through to performance management ratings, which, is not great news, because that means when things returned to normal, as they got back into the office more, in terms of progression, they were going to be more disadvantaged. So I think there are watch outs for this, which is, we know that actually it's really important to create those points of connection. I'm in the middle of Leicester Square today in a bustling office, and I just walked through a marketing department, and to see people around a desk having ideas, generating, innovating, and just sparring off each other, it was just wonderful to see. And it's predominantly young organisation here, and I just thought, that's fantastic. It's been so long since I've seen that, and you don't need that every day, but you do need some of it. And I think lots of organisations are being very thoughtful about how they recreate that in a new hybrid world. They might be saying you must come in 1 or 2 days a week, or a monthly all staff or all hands session in offices. But I think it's going to be tricky, because the degree to which people want to engage with that will be different. And I think there are different groups for whom it'll mean different things.
So how do we make sure that we do build back, not just better, but also more inclusively, and don't forget certain groups or favor, the group for whom it returning to the office is easier versus those that might have more reservations, and those people, as you say, might be more likely to be minorities or people with disabilities, or indeed with caring responsibilities. So what should organizations do, Pavita?
So I'm definitely seeing that most big companies are throwing out their annual surveys and moving to a much more pulse-based approach, so that they can take the temperature on a much more regular basis and test how are people. So trying and testing. So come back 3 days a week. How does that feel? No, don't like that. Okay, so what would work better for you? And I think in the context of the Great Resignation and a hot talent market, they're having to respond really quickly. So they'll suggest something, and the feedback is, no, we don't like that very much. Then they adapt, and then they try again. So I think that's really important. But I think it's also back to where does CMI play? It's with the line managers. So noticing, observing. And one of the big shifts in leadership that has been identified is that now the most number one critical skill for leaders post-pandemic is empathy.
Yeah.
And if you think about the historical command and control style of leader that existed in many organizations for decades, that's countercultural to what's needed to be successful in the next decade.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Mel, you've got a big background in financial services, and a lot of, the financial services approach has been to bring people back more swiftly to a traditional office culture. Do you think that financial services as a sector will become more agile as a result of the pandemic, or should they? What should they be doing?
Well, I think for all of the headlines, and obviously I can't speak for the entire sector, but for all of the headlines, I think I think organisations are trying to be thoughtful about, and as Pavita has described, how they come back better. And I think if some have given the impression that they're not allowing agile working at all, and actually that's not quite true. But there are just some roles, and I think, Pavita said it well, given where she is. There are just some elements of work that do benefit from people coming together, which means we have to lead in a more thoughtful way. So, when you were asking what do I think people need to do, I think we need to think about what was the best of what working in the pandemic taught us. how do we continue to preserve that inside our organization, but be mindful of the fact that there are also things that we lost. And, in financial services, there are quite a young generation of people coming through. And we're trying to work out in all sectors, how do people still have learning experiences when we're working flexibly, when we work completely remotely, as we did during the pandemic. And what we do know is that bringing people together is sometimes essential for that development and learning. So I think, we're all in experimental phase a little bit. And we had the biggest and fastest social experiment of all time, moving to fully flexible working. And now we're having a big social experiment about things that will and won't work. And I think why we need to not just be doing the pulse surveys, which are that they have a value inside our organizations, we also have to be thinking about what's our ambition as an organization, and what do we need to achieve that ambition against the needs of our people. So very complicated, I think, for any organization. And if there were anybody who you could interview that said, don't worry, I have all of the answers, I'd be slightly perturbed.
Yeah, well, that's true. We don't have all of the answers, but this research that when we looked at it, it showed some interesting things. And I suppose you can call it the perception and reality gap to some degree, because almost 80% of the managers we surveyed said, and the female managers we surveyed said, yeah, of course, everybody has equal progression opportunities regardless of gender. But the facts are that we still have 38% of senior leaders in the UK are female, although actually almost 50% of the working population is, so too few senior leaders. And, maybe not enough coaching, training, line management, sponsorship. I'm going to talk about the top later. So why do we have this behavior doing gap? Why do people perceive that everything's fine, but their behavior and the reality says differently? What can we do to close that? I know that's a tough one, but Pavita, how do we close it?
I think in our intention to do the right thing, collectively, there has been a lot of focus on the inputs, talking about what should organizations be doing. So, have a balanced panel, make sure you've got gender representation. If you're targeting ethnic minorities, have someone of color. Because when you talk about those numbers, 38%, remember it's only 1 in 5 in terms of a person of color, even entry level. So it's even worse when you get to ethnicity. And looking at, giving the notion that we all live in a meritocracy, everyone's got fair processes, anyone can apply, all jobs are publicly available. So there is this sense that, oh, look, it's all very transparent now, and my boss is sitting down and talking to me about my development. So if I wanted to, I could progress. But of course, we focused on outputs. What we'd see is that the kind of, as you move through the process, there are less women being promoted, and there are more women leaving and dropping off and doing different things. And we're focusing less on that. So it's a revolving door. We can recruit lots of women, but if as many women are leaving, then, our net position is we've made zero progress. And I don't think there's enough focus on that.
Mm-hmm. And Mel, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we sound a bit too agreeable, Pavita and I, but there is so much that she said that I do agree with. But I think that one of the things, and of course, bias is a theme for International Women's Day this year. And one of the things we know is that I think what's happened is, and I think what Pavita's described is, everybody's become aware that bias exists. Largely people have accepted that biases exist. I mean, maybe a big statement, but I think they have. The idea that all of the things that we're doing is going to mean that we're not biased anymore is a sort of false notion. We continue to be a function of the things that we have been socialized with and biased with. So what it requires is much more intentional intervention on our own personal behalves to any biases that we have, and being much more aware of them. And I just wonder, just to add to what Pavita said, is that whether we are doing enough to measure management in terms of whether their biases are playing out in the people that they're hiring, the people, and how that, and I hesitate to use the word reward, because it's not just about giving people more money for doing good and giving them less for doing not so good. It's about whether we're rewarding the right behaviors in terms of at an individual level in an organization. And I think there are ways for us to do that, not least for the top to be focused on that when they look at how their managers are performing, that it's not just about the bottom line. It's not just about, even the statistics around diversity, but how their teams are feeling and behaving and how valued they feel. Because I think that is a function of when we see people progressing through organizations. What does good leadership look like in your organization?
So what do you say then to the leader in the middle? Let's say it's a senior middle manager that says, but I can't sponsor a woman or a person of color because then I'm discriminating against the men. Or the white men or whatever. What do you say to that person? What would you say to them, Melanie?
Well, I have a few responses, but maybe I shouldn't use them. But just to be serious for a second, what I would say to them is, I am asking you not to see people by the color of their skin or by their gender. I'm asking you to look beyond that and see the skills and capability that they have inside your team, and ask yourself whether you're seeing those skills and capability in the team. That's one element of the answer I would give. And to demonstrate to me why, that there isn't a richer group of people, why they all have to look like one particular type of person. A slightly more aggressive response I would give is that unless you're intentional about going and looking for difference inside your team, which isn't gravitating towards the people you either feel comfortable with or feel like you, and I have to do that as well, which is we all gravitate to people who look and fit with how we feel, then you will not be leading as high performing team as you could. And you have to ask yourself how that reflects on you as a leader and as a manager of people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Pavita, what would you say to that person? Would you give the aggressive response or a different response? Or
I'd say all of the things that Mel has highlighted, but in addition, I'd also say, look, this isn't zero-sum game, right? It's not about lowering the bar, which is a conversation I often hear, particularly across government, but it's about widening the door. It's about saying, how do we ensure that people that maybe haven't had access to the same opportunities as perhaps many of those men might have had through their network or their relationship? So I always say to leaders, this is about you extending your own agency and and championing on a personal level. And it might be really simple things like if they're going to an all-staff, all leadership meeting, all hands meeting with the CEO and the line managers invited, and saying, I'd like to bring the woman that works for me and extend her an invitation, because actually exposure to that group will give her a broader network. Or I'm going to a networking event now that we're going back to things in real life again, and saying, I'd like you to come as my guest. I'd like to introduce you to a new network of individuals, and I'd like you to meet some people that might be helpful in your career. So actually, I think as a middle line manager, people often feel very disenfranchised and feel that they're disempowered to do anything, but actually I think using their own agency, there's a lot they can do.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Go on, Melanie.
There was just one more point I wanted to make, and it is slightly on Pavita's zero-sum game, but I think sometimes we forget that if we are valuing individuals for the full breadth of their skills and capability, and we stop talking about gender and ethnicity and so forth, everyone benefits, because there will be people who have maybe gone unnoticed historically that get noticed when you apply this style of leadership. That's my firm view. So I think for people to feel that they are being excluded as a result of others being included, we would be failing as managers. But if we are constantly focused on, are we including everybody, but making up for the fact that sometimes there are some groups who are not being included as they should, that's how we make real difference.
And I just want to pick up on that, because this came up in a discussion we were having on our 75th. Somebody gave the example of I think one of you referenced it, the leadership program for women. And what happened was a lot of the male line managers were using that program to solve what they perceived as leadership problems, like, oh, this one's too emotional, so she needs to go on the leadership program. Or, that was exactly what one line manager said. Or, oh, this one doesn't assert her opinions enough, so she needs to go on the leadership program. Do you think that that's right? Or do you think, how should companies look at leadership programs? We've touched on new leadership. What do you think, Pavita?
So I'm really conflicted on this because, at one level, I don't agree with the idea about having a gender-specific development program for women, because I think it feeds right into some of those stereotypes, and it allows managers off the hook, both men and women, to say, I'll just push the issue somewhere, I won't actually manage this individual or develop them. But equally, we know that if the route to the top is on a specific program and 75-80% of the people being identified and nominated are men, then of course women are being excluded, which is where this initially came from. I feel slightly differently about ethnic minorities, because I think often ethnic minorities want to network and connect, to understand more about how the organisation works and to surface other issues. So I think it's a different role for that. So I know why we've done it, but I think it can lead to unintended consequences. It would be much more healthy if what we had is 50-50 balance and parity on development programs, that men and women attended equally together. And so we didn't have this idea that women somehow have to go off somewhere, because it feeds into this notion that somehow you're trying to fix women again, which is not what we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. And Melanie, are you in that and of the same view?
I'm in that camp. I mean, I think there is a place. I think for everybody, there is a place. First of all, I think development programs aren't just about identifying people's weaknesses. They're also about identifying people's strengths and growing those, as much as identifying and helping people with their development needs. I don't disagree with Pavita, but I actually do see a place from time to time for women to come together and discuss, as we are doing here. As it happens, there happen to be 3 women on screen, and it is International Women's Day week, and there are times and places for those sort of exchanges of views and experiences. But at the heart of what Pavita said is right, which is we shouldn't be seeing women's programs as some sort of let's fix them. And I think, then we're getting into very dangerous territory. So do I want to see development programs that are 50-50? Absolutely. Do I think from time to time there are places for women to have groups of women that are helping and supporting each other? Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably very fair. But let's flip the coin. We mentioned earlier that, women were doing 2/3 more of the childcare duties versus men in lockdown, for example. And, we know that most organizations we asked, just over 2/3 said, we, of course, have policies to support families and carers, but not enough men are taking up those policies of being carers. So what can we do? What can organizations do to make sure that more men take up those policies? Melanie, what do you think?
Well, I think actually it is a source of great frustration to some companies. I'm not making this a universal point, that they feel like they're actively encouraging it, but it's not happening. And I think that's largely that there are 2 aspects from my perspective. First of all, I'm quite taken by the fact, and I talk to a lot of women, and I have the pleasure of coaching quite a few women, young women, how much social pressure there still is on women to be major caregivers. I don't think we should underestimate that. Before you even get into the workplace and what the workplace can do, there are a lot of social pressures still and stereotypes about what fathers and mothers should be doing with their children. And women feel that for sure. But then when you come to sort of the workplace, I think the thing that is the most powerful is when people see senior leaders and managers role modeling doing this. So making their families, and if that's specifically what we're talking about here, a very visible part of how they operate in their lives. Because I think for all too often, and I confess to doing this myself very early in my career, because sadly, Anne, as you know, I've been working for at least 4 decades almost now. But, you know, it wasn't the thing to make a big thing of the fact that you had boys. And then as I got, you know, came through my career, I realized how important it was for me to be visible about the fact I had children and what I was doing with them. And we shouldn't underestimate that.
Yeah, actually. And what do you think, Pavita? Again, you too have boys. You both have 2 boys, right? But no, how do we get more men taking up parental leave and sharing the
Well,
care?
I just want to share some funny anecdotes. I mean, one is my kids are 11 and 14, so they're still quite young. And I still get so frustrated because if there's any issue at school, it is me that school phones. And it doesn't matter where I am in the world, my phone will ring even if it's 3 o'clock in the morning, despite me telling them I'm going to be traveling. And I think so that's social structures, the expectation, the assumptions that women take all the responsibility. But also, I think, you know, when my children were young, I was working in a large bank at the time. And I remember in half terms, you know, hiding at the soft play centre, trying to dial into calls and pretending I wasn't there. And I just think that how awful, you know, why do we put any parent in that situation that somehow we have to pretend that isn't our reality? And there's a lot of school holidays, and why can't we just be more open? So one of the positives from the pandemic, I think, has driven this real shift in workplace revolution that's happened really quickly in 20 years worth in 18 months. And I think what it's done is really shifted the psychological contract between employers and employees. And now, regardless of whether you're a parent or you love cycling or, you know, you want to go and do pottery or bake off, whatever, the idea that individuals, particularly younger colleagues, are saying, you know, I want to live my life in a way where work is not everything. And particularly now with some of the economic pressures with inflation and oil prices going up, utility bills going through the roof, people are saying, I don't want to live to work anymore. I want to have a much richer life, and therefore I want to be able to create space. And so I have found recently many people saying to me that in their colleagues' open diaries at work, you see much more of men saying, picking the kids up on Tuesday, or I've got a gym class, I've got a spin class at 10 a.m. on Wednesday morning. And so actually the degree to which people feel more able to be all of themselves, and to say that I got used to being able to do that in lockdown because I was able to nip to the gym or exercise on my Peloton. And now I don't want to lose that, actually. I don't want to trade it off. So I think there is a tiny window for us to try and open it wider, to say to people, you know, let's do more of this. But it doesn't respond to the challenge that Mel raised, which is media, society, expectation, you know, gender bias around who is responsible for all these things. And we saw the snapback in the pandemic so quickly that it was virtually always women.
Yeah, no, you're right. But then thinking of some of these behaviors that we need to change, which you've both highlighted, one of the things in our research that surprised me, and there are a couple of things, is that just over half of the female respondents said that managers and leaders ensure men and women receive equal voices in meetings and making decisions. That means that half, just under half, didn't. I mean, does that surprise you? And like, what do we need to do there?
Well, they didn't think about it.
No, but you know what? You know, do we need talking about being more intentional? You know, would you say to line managers and senior leaders, you know, make sure when you have a meeting that all of the voices around the table, the men and the women, contribute and they have an equal voice, and you know, can encourage that, or what do you do?
I think it would be it's quite crass to say that everybody in the, you know, you have to have 50-50 voices in the room. I think what managers and leaders can do, though, is be much more thoughtful about the people that they are going to have in a room for a discussion, because everybody responds in a meeting situation in very, very different ways. And some people, that they are thoughtful and they may have a point that they want to make after the meeting. The question for me is, are you listening? Not are they going to have a voice in there? Are you listening to the views of all of the people around the table? And some of that might happen in the room. Some of it might happen in the way in which you set up the meeting, you know, how you think about the preparation for the meeting. Have you understood the people that you're going to have in the room? And how encouraging are you of the people who have the quietest voices in the room? These are all things that are less crass, but very intentional than saying you have to hear 50% of those voices in the room. They're about how are you leading your team and how are you letting them be heard?
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, here's another surprising stat that I know you commented on. Sponsorship is important. We all know that. We've all had sponsors in our career, and yet only our survey showed that just about 1 in 5, 22% of senior leaders are actually sponsoring or championing women. Now, did that surprise you? And what do we do about that, Pavita?
No, it didn't surprise me, because we know that obviously women and ethnic minorities are heavily over-mentored and under-sponsored. The only thing I would say is that good sponsorship, often the advocacy happens without the individual being around. It happens in the promotion discussions, it happens in the making an introduction over here, or speaking for that person in the right context, in the right environment. So it might not be that the individual knows that that's happening. So I think we have to just recognize that it's not like a mentoring chat where you and I would sit down, have a coffee, and you'd be warm and supportive to me and I go away and feel great. It might be that Mel's my sponsor, but she speaks for me on my behalf at a meeting or to another chair and says, I know you're looking for someone, you should meet Pavita, she's great. She doesn't need to tell me she's done that, but the fact she's done it, she's advocated on my behalf. So I think generally we know it's not happening enough, but I also think it happens, if it happens well and it's happening in the right way, I wouldn't necessarily, if it was about me, I wouldn't necessarily know that had happened.
And Mel, what do you think?
All great points. I mean, I think that I utterly agree with, all I would add is, as to this sort of part of the conversation really, is that if I think about sponsorship, one of the things that, it's like all of these things, we have to be much more intentional and thoughtful about who we're sponsoring. And we're all guilty, back to that gravitational pull, social conditioning. This is the sort of person that I sponsor, and actually really, really testing ourselves. And I think it's fairly obvious inside an organization, particularly as Pavita describes, maybe less to the people who are being sponsored, but by those who are in the room when those big decisions are being made about promotions or allocation of work or whatever else. And I think testing in that room and testing each other on whether we are being equal and fair about how we're thinking about that. So, are we demonstrating we have gravitational pulls to particular people, and why? And I do think that we underestimated our peril how much even pulling each other up on these things in a constructive way can make a complete sea change to how an organization is behaving.
Mm-hmm. So your advice is call it out. If you see a colleague.
Yeah, but one of the reasons I slightly struggle on with the call it out is it feels like it's an accusation of you're not. And of course, ultimately, you're telling somebody that they could be doing something better. But I'd like to think of it less as calling out, but maybe pointing out.
Okay.
That, there's something difficult for me. Look, I think there are things we should call out, right? And that's appropriate language. With this, I think it's about how are we all coaching each other to be better.
Right. Okay. And what about you, Pavita? Are you a pointed out person or a call it out person or something else?
I think, as Mel says, it depends on the context. When you talk about bystanders and allyship and what does that look like, people often say to me, how do you, particularly on issues around race, how can I be a strong ally? And I say it's always more effective if it's not the individual that has to call out what's happened, if someone who's present in the room and observes what's happened speaks on their behalf, because it brings power to the situation and amplifies their voice rather than making a conflict situation. I think one of the things I've noticed as I've sat and chaired and managed hundreds and hundreds of talent review conversations, because that's what I did inside organizations. And it really struck me how people just very inadvertently use language, so men and women, when describing women would use one set of characteristics and traits, and when describing men would use much more forceful, active, forward-thinking, commercial, hard-nosed language. So of course, when you get to the conversation about who should we promote, there was just a natural, as Mel described, gravitational pull towards the men because of the way that they've been described. So my role was often to sort of do exactly what Mel has said, which is say, let's just go back again and start looking at the facts and be more factual about the skills and experiences. And we also know that research shows that with men, we're more prepared to sort of take a leap of faith because we can see into the future and we understand what it might look like to see them in a job they've never done. It's much harder for men and women to do that for women. It's sort of like, well, they've never been a CEO. Well, that's because, well, how would they? They've never been in that job. But that doesn't mean they can't be, because we can't close our minds and see them in that position. So I think it's breaking down some of that language. And sometimes I think it's hard to do that if you don't feel you've got positional power or authority. So I think thinking about who is the person in the room that can be given permission to do that, or if you're all peers and equals in the way that Mel suggested, how can you just ask a question to shift the dynamic of the conversation?
Yeah, those are all great points and some really good tips. And we ended up back where we started, which is with this authority gap. We all have to be mindful of our bias that we might be, seeing some people more in a leader mode than others unintentionally. But before we come to questions, I want to give you each the opportunity, as it is International Women's Day, to say, what is your one key message for the leaders and managers watching today as to how they could move this forward in a positive way? What would be your slogan to them, Mel?
So I've thought about this, and there's so many sort of actions, right, that you could, but I don't think you can get away from the fact you have to be intentional. And I whether it's a slogan, but I, rather than say, I just say be intentional, right? And be intentional in every aspect. Be intentional about identifying women. Be intentional about sponsoring women. Be intentional about gathering the data. And for me, that encompasses everything that will make a difference. And I don't think we can avoid the fact that unless we have intentional leaders, people who want to make change, we won't see the change we want to see.
Mm-hmm. And Pavita, what's your thought?
I'd say two things. I mean, I think, and it applies less to the very, very senior men, because the ones I come across are totally committed and really want to make this work. But I think for middle managers, it starts with you. I think there's a huge assumption in many organisations in that sort of marzipan permafrost layer that somebody else is going to do this. So for them, I'd say it starts with you. With every other leader, I'd say this is about a daily habit. So, 3 things that you can do every day. It doesn't matter what they are. It might be something simple like, agreeing to see an entry-level colleague and having a conversation about their career. It might be interjecting in a conversation and challenging somebody that someone else has said. It might be about asking the HR director to come and say, okay, let's talk about recruitment plans over the next 6 months and think about how we're going to increase the diversity pool for these key roles that we want to hire. I'd really like to see a woman in these jobs. But I think if you've not used to doing it as a daily practice, it's like anything, starting off by literally diarising, I'm going to do 3 things every day.
Well, that's amazing. So be intentional 3 times a day. How about that? Right. Let's take some questions. Thank you both for sharing those fabulous thoughts. My first question is from Ben. So this is a good one. Ben asks, what do you think progressive, dare I say it, younger professional men can do to help positively influence older men in leadership roles to become better sponsors for women? Great question. Melanie?
Right, I think it is a super question. And actually, I'm not going to make assumptions about you, Ben, but I think that at the heart of your question is, what can I do? And I think the truth is that don't underestimate. This is the point that Pavita was making earlier about, somebody shouting out for somebody else and the value that has. So, for example, if you see, and sponsorship comes in many forms, and, work allocation is the most obvious one, where all work is being allocated and you can see that one person is being missed out persistently, call it out. or nudge towards them or ask to work with them. So in fact, at the root of your question, at the heart of your question, I might have said go and talk to them and tell them what they're not doing. But what I'm actually advocating is for you to nudge them into what they should be doing.
Okay, great. Next question is from Adam. Do you think that fewer leaders understand good sponsorship versus those who understand mentoring? And how can we help leaders be better sponsors, particularly of women and other underrepresented groups like ethnic minorities in the management pipeline? Pavita, you said that women are over mentored, under sponsored. So how can we help them be better?
I completely agree with that, and I think it comes back to all line managers' ability to have straight conversations with people, be transparent and set expectations. So as I mentioned earlier, I used to run lots of internal promotion and talent processes. And I would say to the executive committee afterward, who's going to go and speak to X about what we talked about today? And they'd all sort of shuffle their feet and say, oh yeah, that's down to me, that's down to me. And then a week later, I'd follow up with those leaders one level down. And I'd say, has so-and-so spoken to you? And they'd say no, because these are not easy conversations, are they? Because sometimes what you're really saying to someone is, look, we don't think you're going to make it to the next level. We think you're wonderful. We think we really want to keep you and make the most of you, value you. And so these are tricky things. So I definitely think sponsorship is a very complicated area, because often as a line manager, it won't actually be you doing the sponsoring. It might be your boss's boss doing the sponsoring. And that requires you to be able to say, I want to lift this individual and help you see how great they are. And that's not easy if perhaps you're not then in that same talent pipeline. So it can be very complex. But I definitely think that most people don't understand the difference.
Any advice from you, Mel, on how people can be better sponsors?
Well, I think that there's no magic bullet here, but I'm back to my intentional piece, which is go looking. If there's no one obvious, just go looking, and make sure that you calibrate. When you think about who you're supporting. And I've been doing this myself actually recently, which is, who am I shouting out for? And when I think about that group of people, what are the profile of those people? And am I being intentional enough about how broad a circle of people I'm shouting out for? So
yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, really good question here from Alaya. Yesterday was International Women's Day. What was the most important piece of coverage that you saw, and why? Pavita, you're smiling, so I'm going to start with.
I tweeted one at 6:30 this morning, which I loved, which was about deeds and words, and it was about this bot that had been set up to call out any company that had basically done a hashtag International Women's Day. It automatically went to the government website, found their mean gender pay gap and published it. And I just loved it, because actually the first question when I go into a new organization that I do is I look at their website, I look at all the statements about commitment to diversity and everything else. I look at all the pictures and all the pages. And then when I arrive, the first question I see is, please, can I see your gender representation by level at every level of the organization up to CEO? And we're back to deeds and words.
Right. Well, there you go. I saw that. That was a great article. Mel, what about you? I saw that too, and I was quietly chuckling and thought it was fantastic. And look, there's been so much great coverage of many fantastic women as well, which has been fantastic to see. And I don't want to bring us down, but I sort of feel it would be remiss not to sort of talk about, Ukraine and what's going on there in the midst of all of this. And there was a fantastic post by Christine Lagarde reminding us of the disproportionate impact of war on women. Mm-hmm. So whilst we've seen such courage and many visible women inside that war, that the fact is that even for everyone that's fighting, there are many who are there are a lot of victims, but we know that women will disproportionately be affected by war, and I think we shouldn't forget that. Absolutely, it is an excellent point. And actually, one of the pieces of coverage I saw is
And unfortunately, this has gone backwards. We have 14% female leaders in our modern world. 14% of those leaders of countries are women. It used to be 18, so it's gone backwards. Next question here is from Jen, maybe in light of that. How do you think governments and other high-profile leadership examples can better demonstrate and acknowledge the impact of gender-balanced teams? What do you think, Mel?
Well, I think that often in government, there are many fabulous women who are working behind the scenes and aren't necessarily put to the forefront. And I think making the women who are making things happen inside government more visible would be a great start. And I think actually, in fairness, if you look at, and I very rarely say in fairness in this context, but if you look at the sort of UK response to the pandemic, there were, women all over the place, very visible. Sarah Gilbert, you think about Emily Lawson, you got there, Pavita, before me. We're a bit biased on this front because Emily's a great friend of ours, so she had to get a shout out in this context. Who's played an instrumental role in the pandemic. That there have been, many visible women, but we need more, and we need leaders to be asking themselves the question why they haven't got better balanced teams. But at least let's start by acknowledging the women that are doing what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. And Pavita, what would you say? I'm thinking of, I saw that picture, I'm sure you did as well, of the European leaders in Munich, and they were all these white men sat around that table. So I don't know, what would you say to government to do a better job about this issue?
Well, it was the same with the climate conference. There was all those pictures all the time about groups congregating of all men. And I go back to the financial crisis. We were on the precipice of a war, and the Munich Security Conference was all men. And I absolutely agree with what Mel's saying. There would have been amazing women in the background, but just the optics of whoever their PR person was that said, this feels like a really good thing to do. I mean, you'd have just grabbed a woman from somewhere, wouldn't you, and said, can you come in the picture? I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, it's like all male panels. I know people like Lord Davis will not speak on an all male panel. He will refuse to speak. So I think it comes back to some of the men in that picture should have said, we don't want to have this picture taken until we have more women who've been part of this debate represented in this visual image that is going to go around the world. So it comes to the next question, what can women do? I think speaking up, speaking out, we're half the population. Being more requiring, asking of our leaders, of our politicians, of the people that govern us, be basically stating what we want and asking for, advocating for much more change at a much faster pace.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point you make about the men in that photo. One of them should have said something. That was a pointed out, be intentional 3 times a day moment, wasn't it? Why are there only men in this picture? That would have been a great question to ask. All right, our last question in the time we have left is from Jane. Jane wants to know, how does the gender debate need to move on in the next 12 months, Mel? What's moving it on for you?
Well, moving it on for me would be, it's back to deeds, not words, right? Mm-hmm. We need to move away from lots of good intention and lots more measurement of action, and I think we are seeing that. But I also think that we as a population, and I don't mean just women in this, need to be much more demanding about whether those deeds are coming through. So I'm not sure whether that's the kind of the silver bullet answer, but that's how I feel, which is, let's see more action.
Mm-hmm. And Pavita, what about you? What's moving it on for you?
Well, we recently marked the 1-year anniversary of the murder of Sarah Everard, and I think I really reflected on what's changed in the last year. And one of the things that I think has happened is the debate has shifted from, this is about training young women and telling our sisters and our friends, call me when you get home, don't go by yourself, I'll walk you back, somebody else will, a male friend will walk us back. Changing that narrative about what do women have to do to create change, to saying, actually, this is about men changing their behavior. And I had conversations with my sons, my husband, and they were talking about, so what's the one thing I could do? And I would say, don't walk behind a woman, cross the road. And my son said to me, did you have that sort of stuff happen to you growing up? And I said, yes. And they were totally shocked and unaware of how real it is for every single one of us. And I wonder what that would look like if we translated it out to the broader debate around gender progression, which is stop looking to what do women have to do to fix about themselves and all the stuff they have to do to try and make it work for them. And how do we have to shift the context, and how does everybody else, all the other players, need to change their behaviors in order to make it okay for women to be successful?
So that's a great place to end this. Be intentional 3 times a day. Change your behavior. I love that slogan. It's the combination of both of your thoughts. Mel and Pavita, thank you so much. Incredibly wise and insightful words as always. And thank you everybody for joining us. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please do join us at CMI. You can find out how to do so in the chat. Thank you.